Chapter 6. Under the Stress of Discipline. The American societies needed the superintendency of an experienced disciplinarian and organizer. This Wesley read from the somewhat conflicting correspondence which came to him from the field. The oral representations of Captain Webb, who had gone to England to plead for more missionaries, also helped him to his conclusion. It was agreed that a leader or leaders should be supplied. Webb asked for Christopher Hopper and Joseph Benson, great lights of the Wesleyan Conference, but Wesley could spare neither. After some delay, Thomas Rankin, a skilled administrator, a man of mature years, one of Wesley's trusted lieutenants, and who had also seen military service with the King's armies, was sent over to take charge of the work in America. Asbury had, thus, in his turn, an opportunity to show with what grace he could accept a successor. He met Mr. Rankin in Philadelphia on June 3rd, 1773, and received him with great cordiality. Beyond a doubt, it was a relief to be cased of a burden which had sorely weighed him down. Asbury was not greatly impressed with Rankin's preaching, of which he had an early example, but he found no occasion to doubt that, as a disciplinarian, he would fill his place. Of how he filled his place, Asbury's journal during the next few years tells an interesting, if still a very human-like story. The new general assistant took up the work with spirit and vigor. Almost his first official act was to call a conference of the preachers. The sitting began in St. George's Church, Philadelphia, on July 14th, 1773, and was continued for 2 days. Ten preachers were present, 2 of them being George Shadford and Joseph Yearbury, who had come over with Rankin under appointment from Mr. Wesley. 1,160 members were reported in society, being an increase of nearly 1,400% in a little more than 2 years, a tremendous testimony that to the labors and examples of Asbury. This was the first American conference. Previous to this, the preachers had met only in quarterly meetings, but now began that series of yearly gatherings of the itinerants that have created so unique and important a literature and exercised so vast an influence in promoting the growth of Methodism. The disciplinary strictness of Rankin's presidency at this conference gave Asbury much satisfaction, and naturally, for it emphasized his own rulings and contentions during the 2 previous years. The categorical record recites that the old Methodist doctrine and discipline shall be enforced. A decree also went out against those who manifested a desire to abide in the cities and live like gentlemen. That this was meant to have pointed reference to Boardman and Pilmer, there is abundant evidence. Nor did either Rankin or Asbury have any desire to conceal the fact. The administration of that year was free from disingenuity. Asbury had triumphed in his successor. He was full of serenity and confidence, and to add to his composed state of mind, he had, probably, as the retiring superintendent of the work, been permitted to name his own field of labor. He chose Baltimore, where he had left so many great plans unrealized, and from which he had been absent but 3 months. For helpers in Maryland, he had Robert Strawbridge, Abraham Whitworth, and Joseph Yearbury. He was now to see the fulfillment of his hope, expressed in 1772, namely, about 7 preachers, spread 700 or 800 miles, and preaching in as many places as they were able to attend. Within the first 2 hours following the adjournment of the conference, Asbury was in the saddle and on his way toward Bohemia Manor. That night he preached at Chester, and daily thereafter in places to the southward. On July 18th, 2 days after the close of the conference, he made this entry in his journal: "My soul has enjoyed great peace this week, in which I have ridden near 100 miles since my departure from Philadelphia, and have preached often, and sometimes great solemnity has rested on the congregations. The first quarterly meeting in Maryland was held a fortnight after Asbury's arrival. It was marked by no important event, except Strawbridge's recalcitrance in the matter of the sacraments. He would not recognize the authority of the conference to either stop or regulate him. A free-souled Irishman, before his conversion, he had been a Calvinistic dissenter in sympathy, and he did not share the high church prejudices of his English brethren. The arguments so strong with them weighed nothing with him. Asbury could, therefore, do no more than his predecessors had done: leave the honest independent alone. Asbury did not know it then. Perhaps he did not recognize it afterwards. Yeah, we see there in that corner the issue, don't bend pages to mark your place, or you're going to lose a bit of your book at some point. Afterwards, for he regarded Strawbridge as a weak and irregular instrument, but it was the courage and independent honesty of men like Strawbridge that gave so distinct, united to his own love of order and discipline, that gave so distinctly an American and democratic spirit to the conference of 1784, the one that gave to the New World its most characteristic ecclesiasticism. Love of order, well, that can apply something. Yeah, we like society to be in order, but I think the American thing is more about "Don't tread on me," that flag. That was proposed as an American flag, wasn't it? It's not some racist thing or whatever people are claiming. Immediately after the quarterly meeting, Asbury repaired to Baltimore, where he began a campaign which soon made that city the center not only of the Methodism of Maryland, but also of the Methodism of the continent. New York and Philadelphia had at this time each but a single house for Methodist worship. Baltimore had already in the previous year laid the foundations of the famous old Strawberry Alley Chapel, and during this year completed the far more famous house in Lovely Lane, in which the Christmas conference was latter held, and in which Asbury was elected and consecrated to the episcopacy. The circuit which Asbury and his helpers traveled in 1773 contained fully 30 preaching places, Besides these, the assistant added to his own itinerary innumerable stops and detours, each of which ended in a prayer, an exhortation, or a sermon. The journal record of his goings is a ceaseless, tireless cry, from day to day, from dawn to night, save for those days, weeks, and often fortnights, in which the ague and burning fevers caused by malarial poisoning prostrated him and made going impossible. Fully 1/3 of the time, from midsummer 1773, or Vulgaris, to January 1774 of the Common Era, he was confined to his bed in some plantation house or in some tavern by the way, and during the first half of the next year he suffered scarcely less. Surely, never was martyr more indifferent to life. Well, that's an overstatement, but with fevers not wholly abated, weak, faint, and with flesh and muscle flaccid from impoverished blood and depleted tissue, he would mount his horse and ride through drenching rains and miasmic fogs, or whatever other vicissitudes the seasons brought. He was a voice in the weakness, or in strength, in pain, or in joy. The cry was the same. Whatever your mission in life, you got to be equiposed. He hungered for perfection, but was beset by conscious frailties and embarrassed by limitations which he labored to remove. Often he thought himself near the goal of completeness, but admonished by an introspection, he drew back to fight another stage. This recurring record would, if that document possessed no other value, render his journey priceless as a test both of the doctrine and the experience of Christian perfection. Methodism in and about Baltimore advanced rapidly during this year. There was a continuous revival, though the modern protracted meeting was unknown. 6 services were held on an average each week in and about the city. The quarterly meetings were seasons of exceptional interest and power. Asbury attended these in person, and to at least one of them Rankin lent the additional interest of his presidency. Probably 1,000 people were this year converted under the preaching of Asbury and his helpers. The members in society in Maryland increased from 500 to nearly 1,100. At the next conference, the wildly scattered plantations and villages showed a sufficient Methodist population to warrant the organization of 3 separate circuits in the colony. The personal ministry of Asbury, who had learned his manners in service and who had reached his baptism and call in a cotter's barn, made fresh inroads upon the polite and godless people whose estates were embraced within his vast circuit. Even today, it's hard to find a real atheist. I mean, people say it because they don't want to follow some church or something, but I don't know if I've met an atheist. I've talked to people that said they were atheists, and then you talk to them and, oh, they're not atheists. They're just, Mr. Harry Dorsey. Go. Captain Charles Ridgely and Mr. Corral. Wealthy planters and influential men in the colony were amongst his hearers. Captain Ridgely became an early convert, and Mr. Goff and his wife, though slow to yield, were sometimes afterwards blessed with Pentecostal experiences and became the leaders and inspirational types of Methodism. throughout Maryland. Perry Hall, the seat of the Goths, was Goths or Googs? Was one of the most spacious mansions in America. It was situated about a dozen miles from Baltimore and became not only a home for Asbury and other preachers, but was for years a noted Methodist meeting place, its splendid drawing rooms being thrown open for that use. Later, a chapel was built upon the estate and enjoyed the distinction of being the first Methodist chapel in the New World that could boast a bell. Philip William Otterbein of the German Reformed Ministry comes frequently into view in the early history of American Methodism. He was highly endowed, a man of learning and exceptional spirituality. His contact with the Methodists strengthened his naturally evangelical conviction. And in his work, he constantly employed their methods. Asbury came into contact with him during this year, and the attraction was mutual. Through Asbury's influence, Otterbein was settled with a congregation of the Reformed Church in Baltimore, and cooperation between the two began from that hour. The result of Otterbein's ministry in Maryland was the Church of the United Brethren, an organization which is usually classed with the Methodists, and which is so truly Methodistic in spirit and doctrine that the classification is only logical. The Conference of 1774, the second to be held in America, met as had the first in St. George's Church, Philadelphia. 17 preachers were present, and was found that the number in society had grown to 2,073, an increase of nearly 100% over the previous year, as has already been shown. More than one half of these were reported from Asbury's circuit in Maryland. Rankin and Asbury were seldom able to see eye to eye. From the first, the younger man endorsed in qualified terms the fitness of his superior. His administrative qualities he took on faith, but a year of observation reduced that faith to the point of evanishment. The journal of the complainant had, however, been silent, significantly, so that on that point Asbury was religiously honest, and, like the good soldier he was, tried to think well of his general. In a way he succeeded, and his circumstances aided him to a degree in maintaining at least a negative attitude. He was on the circuit he preferred, amongst tender-hearted and sympathetic friends. He was in a state of constant invalidism, and came only occasionally into relations with the military general assistant. The conference, however, brought them together and into conflict. Asbury spoke his mind, and Rankin administered affairs with a strong hand and kept his own counsel. In one thing these two did undoubtedly agree. The dilettante and time-serving Wright, as they judged him to be, was to be sent back to England. Wright had been Asbury's fellow missionary in 1771, and there was no evidence that any personal issues existed between them, but Asbury, who judged and chastened himself, was frank and even-handed with others. So Richard Wright was demitted to England under censor, implied if not expressed, but there's little doubt that both Asbury and Rankin judged him over hardly. Asbury knew the American field and preachers as no other man knew them. Rankin knew them scarcely not at all. Asbury, in addition to being naturally a far more resourceful leader than the general assistant, knew how the preachers should be stationed. Rankin reasoned how it should be done. The widest difference of those two minds was as to where Asbury himself should be appointed. The last place which Asbury would have chosen was the one to which Rankin appointed him. That place was New York. There was a moment of revolt, and Asbury contemplated an immediate return to England, but the soldier in him quickly triumphed, and he acquiesced and joined in the general harmony. The breach between him and Rankin, however, became permanent from this moment. Besides holding in view Asbury's belief that he was contending with Rankin for a policy essential to Methodism, it must be remembered that at this time he was little better than a physical wreck, fever-wasted, nervous, and temperamentally distressed by an effort to keep up, in prolonged sickness, a regimen of labors obviously too much for one in health. About this time he wrote, July 14th, I have now been sick near 10 months, and many days closely confined, yet I have preached about 300 times, and rode nearly 2,000 miles in that time, though very frequently in a high fever. Great way to spread disease. Here is no ease, worldly profit or honor. What then, but the desire of pleasing God and saving souls, could stimulate to such laborious and painful duties? Still later, the more illuminating entry appears in his journal. September 18th, losing some of my ideas in preaching, I was ashamed of myself and pained to see the people waiting to hear what the blunderer had to say. May these things humble me and show me where my strength lieth. And the prayer of Moses is an important one to say for people who are spreading the word, or, have a spiritual mission. Anyways. Oh God, loosen my tongue, and something like that. Asbury was half peasant and half seraph, says Fitchett, an estimate which is not discounted in the reverent view that modern American Methodists have taken of their great forerunner, but the peasant in him was only human. However far off the affinity of the seraphic, and the revelation of that human likeness makes his example all the more valuable to his spiritual offspring. New York, though one of the two earliest fields of Methodism in the New World, had proven to be one of the least fruitful. It had been Asbury's first American charge, and there he had his most harassing experiences. There he had contended for discipline and old Methodism, and had withstood and been withstood by worldly-minded saints. He was, however, on his return to a second incumbency, received with love and many tokens of appreciation, though he was made to realize that the roots of the old resentment had not been eradicated. He was to remain in New York 3 months, but his health continued so poor, and the prospect of his recovery seemed so remote, that his friends and the officials of the charge persuaded Mr. Rankin to extend the time indefinitely. lest a return to the malarious regions northward or westward might increase his distress. His 3 months' term was therefore extended to one of 8 months, credited to most other men. The itinerating and evangelizing done during these 8 months would seem a miracle, but by him they were esteemed as barely worthy of being noted in his journal. Maryland was the magnet of his heart during this season of distress and submission. There his friends were, and there he longed to be. Macedonian hands beckoned to him from the shore of every faith and bay. Importuning messages invited him to return, and that without delay. Influential people even offered to come and conduct him thither, in spite of discipline, if only he said the word, for the spirit of Strawbridge was abroad in the land. And at the end of the 8 months, Mr. Runkin requested him to proceed to Philadelphia. Thus he did, and remained in charge of that important post for 3 months, that is to say, from December 2nd, 1774, to February 22nd, 1775. At the end of that time he set out for Baltimore, possibly with the nominal consent of Runkin, but in reality it would appear as the result of his own choice and insistency. His stay in Baltimore at this time covered about 60 days, but he was much of the time inactive. Perhaps he was restrained by friends who saw his need of rest. His journal, however, shows that he held not a few meetings, that some of them were attended with single manifestations of spiritual power, and that they were fruitful of results. His mind was at rest, and he was constantly refreshed with the fellowship of his friend Otterbein, and with visits to Perry Hall. But even amid these agreeable surroundings, there were evidences that the misunderstanding with Rankin was unreconciled. Before his departure from Philadelphia, letters had gone from both his own and Rankin's hands to Mr. Wesley, though Asbury had been frank enough to read to his superior the statements and complaints which he was sending to England. A diplomatic silence obtained, and the conference session was near at hand. Mr. Wesley would, no doubt, the next year have recalled Asbury to be near himself, or appointed him to service in the Bahamas, but a tragical and unforeseen providence prevented the removal from the New World of its destined apostle. The American Revolution was already a fact, and intercourse between the mother country and the colonies was practically at an end. Don't quite agree with the particular use of the word apostle, but being disciplined and encouraging being disciplined and correcting people is certainly an essential thing. We have too many fluffy, artificially positive preachers nowadays. But that's an essential element too. And of course, preachers setting good examples, not somebody who's going to preach and go hire whores with the money that they made from preaching that, perhaps could have been, if you're going to lead religious services and require them on the people, well, why not pay the same alms as they do and don't make your living off that, make your living off of, standard work or something.